It's the middle of the night in Mumbai, May 1991. An unmarked plane is sitting on the tarmac. Armed officers are loading heavy wooden crates into the cargo hold. Nobody watching knows what's inside. Inside those crates is 67 tons of gold. It's being flown out in secret out of India to the Bank of England. It's being used as collateral because the country, the 7th most populated country on earth at the time, is about to run out of money. I'll be honest with you, you've probably heard of some version of this before. India is rising, the 5th largest economy with the fastest growth on earth. I've said it many times, but the more I've dug into this, rising might be the wrong word. Because what's happening with India right now isn't a growth spurt. It's not a story of a poor country getting rich, it's something much weirder and older. So I want to figure out with you in this video, is India actually rising, or is it returning? And if it's returning, to what? To figure this out, I had to go back 300 years. Because what's happening in India right now isn't about the last 10 years, it's about the last 300. How did it go from one of the most closed economies on earth to a country with Microsoft's biggest headquarters outside the US and a booming tech scene? In the year 1700, India wasn't just wealthy, it was the economic engine of the planet. Take every dollar of economic output in the world that year, 1 out of every 4 of them came from India. This wasn't because the average person in India was richer than the average European. It was because India dominated the things the world actually wanted. Textiles so fine that Europeans had never seen anything like them. Steel that was stronger than anything made in the West, and a trade network that was stretched from East Africa to Indonesia. Mughal India at its height produced a quarter of everything the world needed. For context, today the United States produces 26% of global output. That's roughly the same share India had 300 years ago. And then over the next 250 years, the most valuable economy on earth was systematically dismantled. The British East India Company arrived as traders. Within 100 years, they controlled the government of most of the subcontinent. And within 200, they had reorganized India's entire economy around one job, feeding raw materials to British factories. India's textile industry, the most sophisticated in the world, was deliberately destroyed. Its steel industry collapsed and its manufacturing base was gutted. By 1947, when the British finally left, India's share of the global economy had collapsed from 24% to just under 4%. A quarter of the global economy reduced to less than a 25th. This is not a country that was always poor, it's a country that was made poor. And when India finally became independent, its leaders looked at this wreckage and made a promise: never again. Never again would India let foreign powers dictate its economy. That promise is what almost killed them. For the next 40 years, India ran one of the largest socialist experiments in human history. The government ran everything: airlines, steel mills, telephones, power plants, even bakeries. If you wanted to start a business, you needed a license. If you wanted to expand a business, you needed another license. If you wanted to import anything from abroad, you needed another license for that too. Indians called it the license Raj, Raj meaning rule, the rule of permits. There was a joke at the time that if you wanted a scooter, you'd put your name on a waiting list and the scooter would arrive 8 years later. That's not an exaggeration, that was a real wait time for a Bajaj scooter in the 1980s. The result was exactly what you would expect. Growth was a crawl and poverty was everywhere. Infrastructure in India barely improved for decades. Economists even gave it a nickname. They called it the Hindu rate of growth, around 3.5% per year, year after year, when every other Asian economy was taking off. But here's where it gets interesting, because just a few thousand miles away, another massive Asian country was making the opposite choice. In 1978, China opened its economy. Deng Xiaoping famously said, "It doesn't matter if the cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." Which translates to, we don't care if it's socialism or capitalism, we just want to stop being poor. India saw exactly what China was doing, and India decided we're going to keep doing things our way. For the next 13 years, these two countries ran the closest thing history has ever given us to an A/B test. Two massive Asian economies with hundreds of millions of poor people, two opposite bets on how to escape poverty. China exploded while India crawled, and by 1991, India was completely out of time. Remember that plane? Here's how it ended up on that runway. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait and oil prices doubled overnight. India imports almost all of its oil, so its import bill just exploded. At the same time, the Soviet Union, which had been India's biggest trading partner, was collapsing. So India's exports cratered, and on top of that, 500,000 Indian workers in the Gulf had to be evacuated home. Those workers had been sending money back to their families, and that flow stopped. 3 shocks at once, and India had already been running a deficit for a decade, borrowing foreign money to stay afloat. By June 1991, the country had $1.2 billion in foreign currency left, enough to pay for 3 weeks of imports, not 3 months, 3 weeks. If India ran out, the country literally could not buy fuel. It could not buy food, it could not buy the medicines its pharmacies needed. A nation of 850 million people was about to hit a wall. So the Reserve Bank of India did something almost unthinkable. They pulled 67 tons of the country's gold reserves out of the vault. They put it on an airplane and they flew it in absolute secrecy to Europe to be pledged as collateral for a $600 million emergency loan. In Indian culture, gold is the thing you pawn when everything else has failed. It's the last thing you sell. So for the central bank of an entire country to secretly airlift its gold to London, this is a civilization-level moment of humiliation. And they did it during a general election, so almost nobody in India even knew it was happening. The gold bought India just 6 weeks of time, and in those 6 weeks, a new finance minister was appointed. His name was Manmohan Singh, and he made a decision that would change 1.4 billion lives. Singh ripped the licensed Raj apart, he slashed tariffs, he opened India to foreign investment, he devalued the currency, and he let foreign companies in. He did in a few months what China had taken a decade to do. And just like China, the economy didn't just grow, it took off. But those 40 years of stagnation had a side effect nobody expected. Millions of India's smartest people got on planes and left. Doctors, engineers, and scientists, they moved to America, to Britain, to Canada, Australia, or the Gulf. Not because India lacked talent, but because India lacked opportunity. Today, India has the largest diaspora of any country on earth, more than 18 million people. A diaspora means a population that left its home country but still keeps deep ties to it. Ireland has one of the most famous diasporas, and so does China, but now India has the biggest in the world. And here's the part that nobody, including the Indian government, saw coming. Indians didn't just survive abroad, they quietly took over the upper ranks of the global economy. Satya Nadella, born in Hyderabad, is the CEO of Microsoft. Sundar Pichai, born in Madurai, is the CEO of Google. Leena Nair, born in Kolhapur, is the CEO of Chanel. Raj Subramaniam, born in Kerala, is the CEO of FedEx. As of 2025, 11 companies on the Fortune 500 are run by CEOs of Indian origin. Together, they control over $6.5 trillion in market value. That's more than the entire GDP of every country on Earth except the United States and China. And it's not just the private sector. Indian Americans have the highest median household income of any ethnic group in the United States. Around $150,000 per year, more than double the national average. Indian origin people now even run countries. Leo Varadkar ran Ireland, Rishi Sunak ran Britain, and Kamala Harris ran a major political presidential ticket in the United States. And all these people, the ones who left and the ones who made it big abroad, they send money back home to India, and a lot of it. India now receives more remittances than any country on earth, over $150 billion every year. That's bigger than the GDP of most countries. It's more than India earns from software exports. It's more than all foreign investment into the country combined. For decades, that was the deal. India couldn't give its best people opportunity at home, so they all left and they sent money back. But something is changing. For the first time in a generation, Indians are asking a question that would have seemed crazy in 1991. Do I still leave, or can I build something here in India? If you haven't been to India in the last 10 years, you wouldn't even recognize large parts of it. In a single decade, India has nearly doubled its national highway network and has built more than 80 new airports. And some of them are extremely modern, like Bangalore's or Mumbai's airport. It also built a metro system in Delhi that now carries more daily riders than the New York subway. You can even see the change of India from space. Satellite images of India at night used to look dark, scattered pockets of light around a handful of cities, but now huge parts of the country glow. And the infrastructure that really matters most isn't the flashy stuff, it's the stuff that you don't see. Since 2014, India has built over 120 million toilets in homes that didn't used to have them. For context, that's more toilets that exist in the entire United States. It also has connected over 140 million rural households to clean piped water for the first time in history. It's built wildlife overpasses across its highways, rope bridges for monkeys, and underpasses for elephants. Just trying to thread a gigantic industrial economy through one of the most biodiverse countries on Earth. None of this shows up in GDP numbers, but this is the kind of stuff that changes what it feels like to be alive in a country. And then there's the infrastructure that's invisible. Just 10 years ago, India was one of the most cash-dependent economies in the world. Today, it runs something called UPI, the Unified Payments Interface. It's an instant, free payment system that connects every bank in the country. UPI now processes more than 20 billion transactions every month. Let me put that into context. UPI now handles more daily transactions than Visa and MasterCard. The entire global Visa network, which took 60 years to build, has been passed in under a decade by a public payment system in India. India now accounts for roughly half the real-time digital payments on Earth. And on top of UPI, India built Aadhaar, a biometric ID system that covers 1.4 billion people, the largest digital ID system ever built. And then it rolled out 5G nationwide coverage in under 3 years. Now, almost everyone in India has access to affordable internet. Take a step back, India did not even exist digitally in 1991. It was a country where you had to wait 8 years to buy a scooter. In the span of one human lifetime, it has built the largest real-time payments network in the world, the largest biometric ID system, and it landed on the moon's south pole, something no country has ever done. And then there's manufacturing, which is a quieter story, but maybe the biggest one of all. For the last 30 years, if you want to make something cheaply and well, you made it in China. That was the deal. China was the world's factory, everyone else was the world's customer. But in the last few years, companies have gotten nervous about relying so heavily on one country. Supply chains got tangled during the pandemic, and trade tensions between the US and China keep escalating. So big manufacturers started looking for a second option, a backup factory for the world, and the backup is India. Apple now makes about 1 in every 5 iPhones in India, and the share is climbing fast. Samsung built the world's largest phone factory there, and Tesla is negotiating to enter the country. Global electronics manufacturing is quietly rewiring itself to have India as an option. And a new generation of Indian founders is starting to build at home instead of leaving. The Unicorn is a private startup valued at over $1 billion. 10 years ago, India had fewer than 10. But today it has more than 110, more than any other country except the United States and China, and India has built most of them just in the last 5 years. Flipkart, Zomato, Swiggy, a generation of Indian companies that are entirely homegrown. Companies that just a generation ago would have been started in California. The founders of these companies aren't leaving, and increasingly Indians abroad are starting to come back. Okay, but look, if you go to India right now, it still has a lot of work to do. You'll see streets that flood in the monsoon, or air pollution in Delhi that's dangerous to breathe, and neighborhoods with no reliable electricity. You'll see extreme wealth and extreme poverty living on the same block. You'll see one of the most modern airports on earth, and then you'll drive right past the airport and still see people living in tin houses. Both of these Indias are real, and people outside of India only see one of them. Depending on what media you consume, India is either a slum or a superpower, but in reality it's both at the same time. This is what's confusing about a country going through this kind of transformation. 500 million people have been lifted out of poverty since 1991, one of the largest reductions in human history. But another 600 million people are still waiting for that prosperity to reach them. India has the most billionaires out of any country except the United States and China, but it also has more people living in poverty than any country except a handful of sub-Saharan African countries. But here's the thing, I've spent months looking at this, and it's not about the snapshot, it's about the direction. Most of the rich world is getting older, its populations are shrinking, its infrastructure is aging, and its political systems are exhausted. India has a median age of 28 and has the largest democracy in history. Just in the last election, 640 million votes were counted in a single day. Its population is optimistic in a way that the West is not. 69% of Indians say they're excited about AI compared to just 33% of Americans. It's the most AI optimistic country in the world, tied with Mexico. When a country this big tilts upward, when 1.4 billion people get faster internet, cheaper payments, better infrastructure, new jobs, and a reason to stay home, something happens that the world has only seen a couple of times in modern history. The last time was China, and the time before that was the United States. So let me come back to the question I started with, is India rising or is India returning? Here's the pattern I keep seeing. In 1700, India was the economic engine of the world. By 1947, it was a hollowed-out colony, and from 1947 to 1991, it tried to build a self-sufficient socialist economy and nearly went bankrupt. In 1991, it opened up, and for the last 34 years, it has been climbing back, slowly and then suddenly, towards something that looks a lot more like what it was before 1700 than what it was in 1991. The economists I looked at almost all agree on this trajectory. India will pass Germany and Japan to become the world's third largest economy within the next 3 or 4 years. It won't catch China and the US anytime soon, but the direction is clear. However, there's a thing I want to flag, because people that have thought about this a lot longer than me do not agree on what happens next. Some economists look at India's demographics, its digital infrastructure, its diaspora, its democratic stability, and they say this is the next superpower. The 21st century will be India's century like the 20th was for America. But others look at the same country and see the gaps, the pollution, the inequality, the risk of sliding backward on democracy itself, or the fact that hundreds of millions of Indians still don't have steady jobs. And they warn that India could stall out, that it could become a middle-income country that never quite breaks through like Mexico or Brazil. Big, important, but not transformative. I don't know which one will win, and I don't think anyone really does. But I do know for the first time in almost 300 years, that question is finally open again. India is not just trying to catch up in a world that it left behind, it's re-entering a story that it was once the main character of. And whether India lands back in the center of that story or not, it's going to shape the next century in many ways more than all of us realize. And even if India doesn't, the global network of talented Indian technologists and online citizens almost certainly will. So what do you think? Is India rising or is India returning? I'm Jake Explains, and I cover falling countries and rising countries like India and how the world's changing, so make sure you subscribe for more.